Every Australian tank used in World War II. Australia entered World War II with almost nothing. No tanks, no industry, just 4 outdated machines for an entire continent. By 1945 they had used 13 different tank types from 3 nations, including one they built themselves. This is every Australian tank from World War II. Let's start with the embarrassing beginning. Number 1. The Vickers Medium Mark II, the grandfather of Australian armour. This 12-ton British relic arrived in Australia during the 1920s and became the nation's first real tank. By 1939 it was already obsolete. Slow, thinly armored, and armed with a 47mm gun that couldn't threaten anything modern. But here's the thing. Australia only ever owned 4 of them. 4 tanks for an entire continent. They never saw combat. They trained crews, taught doctrine, and reminded everyone just how unprepared Australia truly was. The Medium Mark II wasn't a weapon. It was a warning. Number 2. The Vickers Light Tank Mark VI. Faster than the Medium, but somehow even more vulnerable, the Mark VI weighed just 5 tons and carried only machine guns. It was designed for reconnaissance, for scouting ahead of the real tanks. Except Australia didn't have any real tanks to scout for. These machines served with the 1st Australian Armoured Division during early training exercises. Crews learned to drive, to communicate, to move as a unit. Then they shipped overseas and discovered that everything they'd trained on was worthless in actual combat. The light tank Mark VI taught Australian tankers how to fight. It just couldn't fight alongside them. When Australian armoured units finally reached combat, they did so in British machines, tanks forged for a war that was already changing. Number 3. The Matilda II, the Queen of the Desert. This 27-ton infantry tank became the most iconic Australian tank of the entire war. With nearly 80mm of frontal armour, the Matilda was virtually immune to most anti-tank weapons in 1941. Italian gunners in North Africa fired round after round and watched in horror as shells bounced harmlessly away. Australian crews loved her for one simple reason. She kept them alive. But the Matilda had a fatal flaw: speed. At just 15 miles per hour maximum, she couldn't exploit breakthroughs or chase retreating enemies. The 2-pounder gun was accurate but increasingly weak against newer German armor. Still, when the war shifted to the Pacific, the Matilda came too. In the jungles of New Guinea and Borneo, her slow speed mattered less. Her thick armor shrugged off Japanese anti-tank fire that would have shredded lighter machines. The Matilda II fought from Tobruk to Tarakan. She was outdated, outgunned, and absolutely beloved. Some tanks win battles. The Matilda kept Australian tankers breathing long enough to win the war. Number 4. The Crusader, the sprinter that couldn't take a punch. Where the Matilda was slow and heavily armored, the Crusader was fast and dangerously exposed. Australian units operated Crusaders during the North African campaign, appreciating the speed but cursing the reliability. Mechanical breakdowns were constant. The Christie suspension gave a smooth ride, but demanded endless maintenance in desert conditions. Sand infiltrated everything. The Crusader could hit 27 miles per hour, nearly twice the Matilda's speed, but its armor was barely half as thick. In tank versus tank combat, that trade-off often proved fatal. Australian crews called it a thoroughbred, beautiful, fast, and fragile. The Crusader represented everything the British got wrong about tank design in the early war, prioritizing mobility over survivability. Still, it fought, and the men inside it fought harder. Number 5. The Valentine, the tank that refused to be defined. Neither fast enough to be a cruiser nor armored enough to be a true infantry tank, the Valentine sat awkwardly in between. Yet somehow, it worked. Australian units used Valentines extensively in training and limited combat operations. The tank was reliable, far more so than the Crusader, and its low silhouette made it harder to hit. The 2-pounder gun was the same as the Matilda's, adequate in 1941, obsolete by 1943. But here's what made the Valentine special. It was adaptable. Crews could count on it starting every morning. Mechanics could repair it without specialized tools. Commanders could trust it to be where it needed to be. The Valentine wasn't glamorous. It was dependable. In war, dependable keeps you alive. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Suddenly American factories were building for Australia, and American tanks were sailing south. Number 6. The M3 Stuart, the Pacific Predator. Officially called the Stuart, but known to Australian crews as the Honey for its sweet handling, this American light tank became the workhorse of jungle warfare. At 14 tons, the Stuart was light enough to cross bridges that would collapse under heavier tanks. Its 37mm gun was effective against Japanese armor, and its speed allowed for rapid flanking maneuvers through narrow jungle tracks. Australian Stuart crews fought at Buna, Salamaua, and across New Guinea. They learned to adapt American machines to Australian conditions, adding extra track plates for traction, removing unnecessary equipment to reduce weight. The Stuart wasn't designed for jungle fighting. Australian ingenuity made it work anyway, fast, agile, and deadly against infantry. The M3 Stuart proved that sometimes the right tank isn't the biggest tank. Number 7. The M3 Grant, the American compromise. The M3 Lee, known by the British designation Grant, was a frankly bizarre design. Its main 75mm gun sat in a side-mounted spunson, limiting traverse. A smaller 37mm gun occupied the turret above. The tank stood absurdly tall, over 10 feet, making it an easy target. Australian units received grants as stopgap measures while waiting for better equipment. Crews appreciated the 75mm gun's firepower, but hated the vehicle's height and awkward layout. In the Pacific, the Grant's limitations were partially offset by Japanese anti-tank capabilities, which were generally inferior to German weapons. The 75mm gun devastated bunkers and fortifications, but everyone knew the Grant was temporary, a bridge to something better. Still, it filled the gap, and filling the gap saved lives. Number 8. The M4 Sherman, the tank that won the war. Eventually, by 1944, M4 Shermans were arriving in Australian service. Finally, here was a tank with a fully rotating turret, mounting a 75mm gun, reasonable armor, and acceptable reliability. Australian Sherman units deployed to Borneo in the war's final months. They provided fire support for infantry assaults on Japanese positions at Balikpapan and Labuan. The Sherman wasn't perfect. Its armor couldn't match German heavy tanks, and its gasoline engine earned the grim nickname Ronson for its tendency to catch fire when penetrated. But against Japanese opposition, the Sherman was overwhelming. Japanese anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate its frontal armor, and its 75mm gun demolished fortifications with ease. The Sherman arrived late to Australia's war, but it arrived in time to help end it. Number 9. The LVT Buffalo. Not quite a tank, but close enough to count. The landing vehicle tracked was an amphibious assault craft that could swim ashore and keep fighting on land. Australian forces used LVT-4 Buffaloes during the Borneo campaign, delivering troops directly onto hostile beaches under fire. Armed with machine guns and light armor, the Buffalo wasn't designed for tank combat, but it could go places no other armored vehicle could reach, straight from ship to shore without stopping. At Balikpapan, Australian Buffaloes carried infantry across coral reefs and up onto beaches, their tracks grinding through sand while Japanese defenders opened fire. The Buffalo blurred the line between boat and tank. In the island-hopping Pacific War, that made it invaluable. With Japanese forces advancing and British tanks unavailable, Australia did something unprecedented. They built their own. Number 10. The AC1 Sentinel, Australia's first and only indigenous tank. In 1940, with Britain fighting for survival and unable to spare tanks for Pacific defense, Australia launched an emergency program to build tanks domestically. The result was the Sentinel. The AC1 mounted a 2-pounder gun in a fully rotating turret atop a hull cast from a single piece of steel, a manufacturing first that impressed even American engineers. The tank weighed 28 tons and could reach 30 miles per hour. Here's the remarkable part. Australia had no tank industry. Engineers learned by disassembling imported vehicles. Factories tooled up from scratch. The automotive sector adapted civilian production lines for war. The first Sentinels rolled off the line in 1942. They were good tanks, arguably better than what Australia was receiving from overseas. But by the time production scaled up, American tanks were flooding the Pacific in numbers Australian factories couldn't match. The Sentinel never saw combat. 65 were built, 0 fired shots in anger. Still, the Sentinel proved something important. Australia could build tanks, could innovate, could defend itself. That knowledge mattered more than any battle. Number 11. The AC-3 Thunderbolt, the Sentinel's bigger brother. The AC-3 upgraded the Sentinel design with a 25-pounder gun, the same artillery piece that supported Australian infantry across every theater. This gave the Thunderbolt genuine firepower against fortifications and enemy armor alike. Only a handful were completed before the program ended. American Shermans made the project redundant. The AC-3 remains a symbol of what might have been, an Australian tank that could have rivaled anything in the Pacific War. Number 12. The AC-4, the ultimate Sentinel variant that almost existed. Plans called for mounting a 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the best tank killers of the war, into the Sentinel chassis. Trials proved successful. The 17-pounder fit. If produced, the AC-4 would have been capable of destroying any Japanese tank at range, and competitive even against German armor. But the war ended first. Production never happened. The AC-4 exists only as a prototype and a promise. Sometimes, the best tank is the one your enemy leaves behind. Number 13. The Type 95 Hencher-Go, Japan's most common light tank, and occasionally, Australia's too. Australian forces captured numerous Type 95 Hencher-Go tanks across the Pacific. Some were pressed into service for evaluation, training, or even limited combat use against their former owners. The Hencher-Go was lightly armored and poorly gunned compared to Allied tanks, Its 37mm gun was adequate against infantry, but struggled against anything armored. Still, captured Hencher Goes taught Australian tankers how Japanese armor operated. Its weaknesses, its blind spots, its vulnerabilities. Know your enemy, even if you have to steal him to learn. 13 tank types. 3 nations. 6 years of war. Australian tankers started with 4 obsolete machines and ended up fighting across deserts, jungles, and islands. They crewed British Matildas, American Stuarts, and homegrown Sentinels that never saw combat. The men inside were farmers, factory workers, and teachers. They made foreign machines work in conditions they were never designed for. Today, these tanks sit in museums. The crews are almost all gone. But what they proved endures. A nation with no tank industry built one. Soldiers trained on junk mastered everything. Adaptation beats preparation every time. So which Australian tank deserved more recognition? Drop your answer in the comments.